good afternoon. Thanks for coming out to celebrate this wonderful recognition of one of our best faculty members at the University of Montana. We're here to recognize a faculty member who won the Case Professor of the Year Award. This is a national award given to a maximum of one person per state, and I think only about 36 or 37 of them were given out this year, so Doug is in great company. We have had a number of Case professors over the years. The nomination must speak to the individual's contribution to higher education at multiple levels. It must speak to ingenuity, impact, and perhaps most important, it must speak to this individual's ability to inspire students. At the University of Montana, we're proud to have an outstanding faculty overall, many of whom, almost all of whom, meet that definition. Indeed, we hire faculty members based on their ability to be a teacher scholar. We look for people who love their disciplines, love the bugs and things that they get to work with, but they also love teaching about those disciplines to others and inspiring the next generation of students. These are faculty members who see themselves as mentors to our students. The CASE process gives us the opportunity to nominate one such individual on a yearly basis. Doug Emlem, professor of biology, exemplifies the model of teacher-scholar here at the university. He was nominated for this award by Dean Comer and Associate Dean Charlie Jansen. You'll hear from Charlie in just a few moments. Doug has already been the recipient of a distinguished award from the National Science Foundation called the Career Award, which signals a rare individual who excels in both research and teaching. He also received the Presidential Early Career Award in Science and Engineering from the White House early in his career. To our great fortune, Doug came to us after a postdoc at Duke University, a PhD at Princeton University, and an undergraduate degree from Cornell. I'd like to mention just two examples of Doug's impact on education, an impact that has taken place not just here at the University of Montana, but really much broader around the country and indeed beyond. With co-author Carl Zimmer, Doug has written a major and widely used textbook called Evolution, Making Sense of Life. It's an impressive book, and I have a copy on my bookshelf in the office. But furthermore, Doug used electronic media to create an integrated paper and electronic tablet version of that text, full of interactive demos that lead to intuitive understanding on the part of the students. These materials are used at hundreds of programs around the country. But Doug's teaching doesn't stop with traditional undergraduates and graduate students at the university. He's played a major role in educating the public through his popular book called Animal Weapons, The Evolution of Battle. That book describes the development of weapons within the animal kingdom, right on up to the weapons developed by the species Homo sapiens. This book is provocative, and it was recognized this past year as the Phi Beta Kappa Book of the Year. Before I ask Provost Brown to say a few words, Doug, I want to say that I know you as among our most passionate teachers and even more importantly, among our most passionate university citizens. And I want to thank you for all the work that you do for the university in the field of biology, but also in the broader sense of higher education for our students. So congratulations, Professor Emlem. I'm very proud of you, and thanks for doing such a great job of representing the University of Montana in all that you do. And now would you join me in welcoming to the microphone Provost Perry Brown.
Thank you, President Engstrom, and let me just offer my welcome to this celebration of Doug Emlem. I'm going to talk a little bit personally about Doug, just from my own feeling, but I've come to know Doug in a number of different ways. One, of course, as a charismatic, fantastic teacher and scholar. Another, as a campus citizen, as the President just mentioned, as an engaging communicator, as a mentor to students and faculty alike, and as a friend to many. Among the very large group of outstanding faculty and accomplished faculty that we have as teachers and scholars at the University of Montana, I think Doug is a fantastic professor to represent all of them as the Case Montana Professor of the Year. I consider Doug a friend and a colleague. He is a delightful, enthusiastic person and a wonderful and engaged professor who stimulates all of us, students, faculty, staff, administrators, alumni, and friends of UM, to do our very best. And if we could have Doug come forward now, we would like to honor him with the Case Professor of the Year Award.
And now I would like to invite Associate Dean Charlie Jansen to the stage for an introduction for Doug's talk. So, Charlie.
So thanks so much. Professor Doug Emlem comes from a line of prominent biologists, starting from his respected grandfather, J.T. Emlem, and tracing through his also famous father, Steve Emlem. And I believe a number of the members of the audience may have taken courses from both of these people. So I think you could honestly say that teaching biology is in Doug's blood. From this background emerged Doug's genuine love of the diversity of nature, an unquenchable curiosity about how organisms work, a keen intellect with which to probe those mysteries, and a real knack for communicating his fascinating discoveries with others, whether they be students, reporters, or the public at large. All these traits unite to create a singularly gifted teacher who well deserves the honor of Case Professor of the Year. Doug is, as already mentioned, a brilliant example of a teacher-scholar. His scientific results have been published in the most prestigious journals on the planet. His articles have been cited thousands of times, and his gift for visual presentation often garners his studies extra visibility as the front covers of journal issues. What he studies is how and why animals have evolved large weapons, horns, antlers, and claws, as you'll see. At one level, this question is intuitive and easy to communicate, yet the details of the mechanisms are complex. To advance discoveries in this area takes both patience and a specialized knowledge of the amazingly intricate developmental interaction of genes and their surrounding cells. It is a topic that could easily be obscured by specialized jargon, confused by even small leaps of logic, and ultimately boring to non-biologists. Doug has, instead, managed to infuse his work with rigor, simplicity, and compelling connections that make his students and a broader public appreciate and share his enthusiasm for biology. Doug's teaching does not fundamentally rely on modern gadgets or teaching innovations, but instead emphasizes careful preparation of the underlying logic interwoven with the human component of science. He typically illustrates an important concept in biology with a detailed case history. He will tell the story about the sometimes indirect and often creative pathway of the first scientists to tackle a question. He will work through an example in meticulous detail so that anyone can follow it. He will show how that concept has impacted human affairs, from warfare to epidemics to fashion. He throws out questions to the audience to make sure that they get it. Ultimately, Doug's approach reveals that science is not an activity restricted to a small academic elite, but a common human approach to understanding our world, in which a few of us have specialized. Doug cares deeply about student intellectual growth and success. UM students often comment on how Doug really cares about their own progress, how he inspired them to love biology, how he took time to mentor them in areas outside of the classroom, and promoted their success even when it was not a direct extension of the work in his lab. Those fortunate enough to work in Doug's lab typically state that the experience was life-changing in both small and big ways. Doug's enthusiasm for the natural world and his passion to communicate have led him naturally to become a teacher to the state, the nation, and the world. Through his many interviews on radio, in print, and on the web, through his popular textbook on evolution and his recent popular book on animal and human weapons, he has helped to spread understanding about the biological roots of some human problems to a vast audience. Because of Dr. Emlem's dedication as a mentor, his inspiring success as a teacher, his impact on thousands of students at UM and across the United States, and his energy in promoting biology to a broad public, we nominated him for the Case Professor of the Year Award. We are thrilled that he has been recognized by the Case Selection Committee as the Montana Professor of the Year. Congratulations, Doug.
Can't tell if can you hear me? Yes? Yes. Thank you, all of you. That means a lot. So as they said, my name is Doug Emlem, and for the past 20 or so years, my research has focused on the development and evolution of weapons in beetles. Horns and enlarged mandibles in crazy things like dung beetles, and in these guys, the rhinoceros beetles. And for those of you that have never had a chance to see these things, I have show and tell. I have a couple specimens, live animals of rhinoceros and stag beetles. But about 4 or so years ago, I had an opportunity to step back and to work through the literature on all sorts of extreme animal weapons in groups of animals that are very, very different from beetles. And what unfolded was a surprising and amazing journey into the worlds of some of nature's most fantastic creatures. And it's that journey that I want to share with you today. So I want to talk to you about weapons, but not just any weapons here. I'm talking about extreme weapons, really, really big weapons. These structures are so big that when you look at the animals that wield them, it's hard to believe they're real. These animals look like they should tip over or trip or collapse under the load. How did their weapons get to be so big? And is there such a thing as too big? Big, incidentally, is a relative term. So 15-foot tusks on a mammoth are big by anybody's standards. But relative to their body size, the half-inch antlers on this moose fly are just as extreme. One of these species is 10 million times heavier than the other. One of them lived in barren, icy tundra, while the other lurks on rotted logs in lowland forest understories of tropical New Guinea. The life histories, the diets, the behaviors of these species differ in so many ways that it's hard to imagine two animals more different in the essentials of their biology, yet they each invest spectacularly into the production of an extreme weapon. And the reason they do it is the same. In fact, it now appears that all of these species wield extreme weapons for the same basic reason. In every one of them, their weapons got caught up in an arms race. So populations of these species got locked in a cycle where bigger was better. It was a lot better, and weapon sizes started to ratchet up fast, getting bigger and bigger and bigger until these animals were wielding spectacular structures. What's fun, though, is looking at why each of those species got caught up in a race. Because I'm going to suggest to you today that despite an extraordinary breadth of habitats and behaviors, the same set of preconditions set the stage for the evolution of their weapons, sort of loading and cocking the gun, if you will, for the triggering of their arms race. And what's more, once started, all of these arms races proceeded through the same sequence of stages. And when they end, when these arms races stall or collapse, they end for the same types of reasons. So what this means when you think about it is that the essential biology of extreme weapons is the same. And I find it astounding that one simple process can help us explain such a diversity of extreme animal forms. So my objectives today are twofold. First, I'm going to introduce you to this sort of essential biology of extreme weapons, the logic of these arms races. And I'll show you how it is that this process begins, so how an arms race gets triggered or launched, so to speak. And I'll show you why it is that this same basic process helps us understand an incredible diversity of extreme weapon forms, ranging from elk and caribou and ibex to beetles, bees, flies, and crabs. And then second, I'm going to take these ideas for a spin, and I'm going to try to convince you that exactly the same logic applies to our own weapons. For we humans make weapons too. Manufactured weapons aren't parts of our bodies like tusks or horns, and instructions for their construction aren't encoded in DNA. But their forms change over time in much the same way as animal weapons. And the directions of this evolution are molded by similar forces of selection. So successful models are copied and spread, while less successful ones gradually disappear, so that populations, if you will, of manufactured weapons transform through time. And when the conditions are just right, these weapons can get caught up in arms races too, surging forward to bigger and bigger sizes, deadlier, faster, vastly more expensive, until the race climaxes with weapons of outlandish proportion and cost. Arms races, I'm going to suggest to you, are arms races, and their central logic is always the same. Now I have to ask, it's very loud to me up here. Is it deafening out there, or is that just an artifact? It's okay. Thank you. Just checking. All right. First, some background, though. It's important to recognize at the outset that most animal weapons are small. So just about every animal has a weapon of some sort. So cats have claws, eagles have talons, even dogs have a respectable set of teeth. But these weapons are not exaggerated. There's enough fang or claw to grab prey or slice flesh, but there's nothing out of proportion, nothing that's awkward in any way. And that's because selection on these weapons is balanced. So consider something like canine teeth. Bigger teeth are better for killing larger prey. But they can also get bulky and awkward, and they can begin to slow predators down, making it less likely that those predators catch their prey in the first place. So no predator that has to chase down prey ever has extreme weapons. Unless you think I'm crazy here, I want you to consider just one example. I also brought a show and tell for this one too. Canine teeth in saber-tooths got really big. So extreme canines actually arose independently in 4 different lineages of mammalian carnivores. And in every instance where these teeth got big, the head got really messed up. Squashed faces with the head tilted backwards at an odd angle. The lower jaws had to come completely unhinged, like releasing the bottom plate on a stapler, in order to get it out of the way so that those ridiculous canine teeth could be pointed forward and plunged into the necks of prey. These animals were awkward and gangly. There is no way that they ran fast. They couldn't have. With their heads tilted backwards, they literally couldn't have seen where they were going. These animals couldn't even eat efficiently because the saber teeth got in the way. So they had to gnaw at food through the sides of their mouths to get past these ridiculous structures. Now this is an extreme, I realize, but it illustrates the point that big weapons might be better for killing, but they can get in the way of other critical tasks like catching prey in the first place. And in general, when it comes to running faster, maneuvering to chase down prey, smaller weapons are better. They're lighter, and they don't get in the way. Well, since most hunters need to do both things, they have to chase down prey to catch it, and then they have to kill it once they've caught it, the net effect of selection on their weapons is a balance. Too small and these animals have trouble too small and they have trouble killing their prey. Too large and these animals have trouble catching the prey. The result is a balance. Well, whenever selection on weapons is balanced, the result is going to be modesty in size. So enough tooth or claw to catch and kill prey, but not so much that it slows you down. Nothing big enough that it impedes your maneuverability in any way. And it turns out that this situation, or something very much like it, applies to the overwhelming majority of animal weapons, and it helps us understand why most weapons stay small. It also provides a conceptual framework, if you will, a baseline for starting to consider when and why some weapons get big. And I'm going to propose to you today that there are 2 basic ways that this balance breaks down. One of them is relatively rare, but pretty cool nonetheless, and the other one is much more common. So the first way that this balance breaks down is if that counteracting selection disappears. So if you think back to predators again, the reason that big weapons was bad was that they slow you down. They make it harder to overtake and capture fleeing prey. But not all predators chase after their prey. I mean, yes, lynx and cheetahs do, and so do falcons and tuna, but some predators wait for the prey to come to them. So they lurk, and then they ambush prey by surprise. Ambush predators don't need to run or fly or swim fast. They sit and they wait, and then they snatch out with jaws or claspers to grab unsuspecting prey as they amble by. Well, for these specialized predators, the cost of big weapons is minimal. It doesn't matter if they're awkward, as long as their jaws or their arms can whip out fast, and longer or bigger arms whip out faster than smaller arms. So selection for big weapons prevails. And many of these predators, it turns out, ambush predators, have spectacular weapons. So just to give you a couple examples, you've been staring at an example of a praying mantis, famous for their enlarged sort of raptorial forelegs. The marine equivalent of these are the pistol and the mantis shrimp, ambush predators that snatch out with their jaws. Ant lions, by the way, these guys sit at the bottom of these little sand pits and they flick sand up to knock ants down into the bottom. And those of you that are here that either are kids or have kids and are into Star Wars, I will bet the farm that the little pit outside of Jabba's palace of Sarnak was modeled after ant lions. All of the crazy deep sea fish that are basically mouths with teeth and a tail, these are all ambush predators. So the viperfish and the gulper eels and the deep sea anglerfish, these things use dangling globs of light that they hang in the dark and that they put in front of their faces as a way to draw the prey to them. Then there are things like lurkers, technically. So alligator gar aren't sit-and-wait predators. They move slowly through the murk in the bottom of streams, and they flick their jaws to the side, but it's the same basic idea. And saber-tooths, incidentally, reconstructions of their joints and muscles suggest that these guys actually dropped out of tree branches onto unsuspecting prey. Well, for all of these animals, a change in their behavior, a change in their hunting strategy created a situation where bigger weapons performed better. And from that point forward, selection for giant weapons prevailed. But most extreme weapons are not wielded by predators, and the weapons themselves are not used for hunting. Instead, these weapons are used in competition, battles between rival males for access to females, a process called sexual selection. And I have a sequence of slides I can go through after the talk, if you like, that explains why it is almost always males battling rival males and not the other way around. But for now, I'm asking you to take my word for it. When competition for mates drives the evolution of extreme weapons, it is essentially always a process that unfolds in males rather than females. But competition isn't enough. Males in lots of species compete with each other in one way or another without it leading to the evolution of weapons. So males rival each other to sing the loudest or the most complex or attractive songs, or to dance the most vigorously, or to wave the biggest and the brightest displays. Competition in these species can be every bit as intense, but it doesn't lead to investment in large weapons. So competition, it turns out, is absolutely critical. It's the fuel that drives the arms race, if you want to put it that way. And in this case, it's the first critical prerequisite for an arms race. But two additional conditions must also be met before a competition can push a population into an arms race. There must be a limiting resource that is economically defensible, so a backdrop or a substrate on which the fights can take place. And the fights themselves must occur as duels, one-on-one, rather than in chaotic melees or scrambles. And these last two prerequisites very often go hand in hand. And I'm going to focus primarily on this last one today, the idea of duels. It turns out that the nature of the fight, so the details of the battle, has a lot to do with what types and sizes of weapons are favored. And some species fight in frenzied acrobatic midair snarls, twisting and tackling and chasing each other in high-speed flight. Many birds and butterflies do this, as do cicada killer wasps. Others, like these horseshoe crabs, pile on top of rivals in chaotic scrambles as 3, 4, or even more males tumble into the fray. Big weapons don't help in these fights. They're not cost-effective, either because the outcome of the fights is too unpredictable, so too heavily influenced by chance for investment in the weapons to be worth it, or because speed or agility matter more than bulk and strength. So just as with predators, big weapons can slow you down. They can impede maneuverability. And fighting males that whirl around in the air would actually fare worse if they wielded big weapons. And in these species, the benefits of big weapons just aren't worth the price. Duels, on the other hand, are different. The outcome of duels is much more consistent and predictable. One-on-one fights very often stabilize into matched contests of size and strength, repeatable, even ritualized engagements where rival males lock their weapons and push or twist, straining against each other until one of the males yields. In these fights, weapons often make all the difference. And the bigger, stronger male, the male with the bigger weapons, wins. So in our sort of anthropomorphic terminology, we would consider duels to be fair fights because the better fighter almost always wins. And it's no accident that for 5,000 years of recorded human history, in just about every culture, the only type of fight that has ever mattered for honor or status was the duel. Ritualized, repeatable, and fair. When rival males face each other in battle one-on-one in contests of strength, males with bigger or better weapons win. Remember that, because I'm going to come back to this in a minute, since duels are a critical prerequisite for human arms races too. But when we look to animals, we can now begin to explain so much diversity because we're looking at a generalizable set of prerequisites that appears to set the stage for arms races. And what I'm suggesting is that when these conditions are met, selection often favors rapid evolution of bigger and bigger and bigger weapons. This was that second way that the balance gets disrupted. When these three preconditions are met, selection for big weapons becomes so strong that it eclipses any costs associated with these structures. Nothing else matters. The payoffs for big weapons trumps all other forces of selection acting on these animals, launching their populations onto trajectories of explosive weapon evolution, culminating with these males that wield tremendous structures. Now, in contrast, when even one of those prerequisites fails, the process breaks down and weapons stop being practical. Literally, like stars coming out of alignment, these arms races should collapse because suddenly the costs of these massive structures should vastly outweigh the benefits. And males without big weapons will start doing a whole lot better than the males with the big weapons. And we expect that these huge structures should quickly disappear. Well, all right, so what do these conditions look like in the real world? So here's the fun part, because it turns out that there are some very predictable ecological circumstances that set the stage for arms races. Some environments or habitats tip the balance. So they constrain animal behavior in ways that cause these critical prerequisites to fall into place. And not surprisingly, these special situations act like cauldrons, facilitating the evolution of extreme weapons. And I want to show you what I mean using dung beetles. Walk into a tropical forest. Where I did this was in Panama, and find a troop of monkeys. So where I did this for many years, and where I did this, the monkeys that we looked for meant howler monkeys. And you find the monkeys in the forest, and then you wait for them to go to the bathroom. It's an inglamorous job, I know. All these biologists go tromping out into the forest. That biologist in particular goes tromping out into the forest to look at the monkeys. And here I am out there in the forest looking at the dung. But what happens is that the dung rains down from the canopy, and it scatters on branches and then settles in fragments on the forest floor in pieces. And if you happen to be there when this happens and you look, you're in for a real treat because the forest comes alive with beetles. Within seconds, they're humming in and plonking down next to the dung, First tens, then hundreds. Within just a few minutes, there will be thousands of dung beetles all converging on these pieces of monkey dung. Within the Panama forest where I worked, there could be as many as 20 different species. And some of these species had amazing horns, rigid skeletal outgrowths that protrude from the bodies of the males. These could be curved, they could be broad, they could be branched. Some species have 1, some have 2, others have 4, some have 5 different types of horns. And these horns are big, so they can be longer than the rest of the male in some species, and in other species they can comprise 30% of the male's body weight. Literally, that is like you or me walking around with a coffee table fused to the top of our head. So these are big weapons. But only half of these species in this forest have the horns. Lots of the dung beetle species in these same areas are completely weapon-free. Flash to Africa, find the same thing. Flip over a pile of fresh elephant dung and look at the species. So here, there can be 100,000 beetles clambering over one pile of dung. I mean, it is a big pile of dung, but that's a lot of competition nonetheless. And here, there will be at least 100 different species of beetle all coming into the same resource at the same time instead of the 20 that you'd see in Panama. But here too, only about half of the species invest in these weapons. Some of these species have incredible weapons, but the other half of the species in these environments will be weapon-free. Same habitat, same season, same food resource, literally even the same pile of dung, and only half of the species that are coming into that invest in these big weapons. Why? Well, it turns out that these species differ from each other in one all-important way, and it has to do with what they do after they get to the dung. Some species are ball rollers, and admittedly, these are the guys that most people think of if they ever stop to think about dung beetles. The males carve these hunks of dung off from the pile, they sculpt it into a sphere, and they start pushing it away from everybody else. Females often follow along. They'll either run beside the male, or sometimes they'll cling to the ball and somersault along. These males get trounced constantly by rival males, and the battles are commonplace and fierce. But these battles occur out in the open in scrambles, often with 2 or more rival males all pouncing simultaneously. These chaotic scrambles are unpredictable, and the fights are often pile-ups. They're not one-on-one duels. Other species in these same habitats do not roll the balls. Instead, they dig tunnels down into the soil directly beneath the dung. Females stay down inside the tunnels, pulling dung down to the ends to provision the young, and the males plant themselves at the entrances to these tunnels, and they fight off would-be intruders. Well, both types of species fight intense battles over access to the dung and to females. One set fights in the open in these scrambles, and the other set fights inside tunnels. And it's the species that fight inside the tunnels that have the horns. Tunnels make all the difference here. They restrict access to females, making it cost-effective or economical to defend. And they align male interactions so that fights have to occur one-on-one. In order to challenge, a rival male has to enter into the tunnel. Only one male can fit in there at a time, and he's pretty much got to face his opponent face to face. So tunnels confine fights so that they always unfold as duels rather than scrambles. Males can brace themselves and push or pry, so strength and weapon size matter more than things like agility or speed. Tunnels cause the prerequisites for arms races to fall into place, and tunneling species often have extreme weapons. Ball rollers never do. So one simple change in the way that these beetles hide their food resource had profound consequences for the evolution of their weapons. Tunnels tip the balance. Well, it turns out that tunnels tip the balance in favor of weapon evolution in lots and lots of animal species. So shrimp and crabs that fight over burrows or tunnels often have huge claws. Fiddler crabs are super examples. Wasps with long tusks fight over burrows. In this case, they're tubular entrances to these mud nests that are cemented on the undersides of leaves. Big-headed, big-mandibled bees fight over burrows. Tusked wettas, these are essentially giant New Zealand crickets, fight over burrows. There are even fanged frogs that fight over burrows. And there was a giant horned rodent that, if I'm not mistaken, lived here in Montana that appears to have fought over burrows. In species after species, the constricted space of a tunnel aligned male contests so that they necessarily occurred face-to-face and one-on-one, and that triggered an arms race. Well, branches work the same way. I mean, in a sense, a branch is just an inverse or inside-out tunnel, since a branch, like a tunnel, is a linear substrate that can be blocked and along which a rival must pass. So branches also align fights so that the rivals approach each other face-to-face and one at a time. There are rhinoceros beetles that fight over branches. There are leaf-footed bugs with huge, massive hind legs that fight over branches. Stalk-eyed flies fight over branches. Even horned chameleons fight over branches, and all of these species have these huge weapons too. Finally, there are species that fight out in the open that still end up fighting in duels. So in this case, it turns out it's the nature of the fights themselves that accomplishes this. So males use their weapons to size each other up, and they start their fights with these sort of proud side-by-side struts and waving displays. And then, if they're still matched, by poking and prodding and gentle sparring, essentially ratcheting up the intensity or the danger level of these fights in steps, escalating all the way only when the males are very evenly matched. Well, fights like this, they don't happen by accident, and they don't happen by surprise. They escalate slowly and predictably, and by the time these fights get dangerous, they are always one-on-one. So even out in the open, their fights fulfill our essential prerequisites of unfolding in duels rather than scrambles. So I just want to step back for a minute and try to wrap all this up. I've just given you a whirlwind tour of dozens of different species, from flies and crabs to beetles and caribou and elk. Well, all of these species invest in the production of these extravagant, arguably ridiculous weapons, and they all do it for the same basic reason. The same set of prerequisites sets the stage for their arms races: intense competition combined with limiting and localized or economically defensible resources, and one-on-one contests or duels. Well, what this insight offers is a generalizable explanation for when and why particular species evolve extreme weapons. Well, I've just shown you why I think that common set of prerequisites or circumstances triggers arms races in all of these different species. Well, it also turns out that once these arms races start, they all unfold in the same basic way. So they all proceed through the same sequence of stages, if you will. And all of these arms races end for the same types of reasons. So those stars come out of alignment, that balance tips back, and these arms races collapse, and the big weapons disappear. So there really is an essential biology of arms races. Now today I focused on the conditions that start an arms race, and in particular I focused on the importance of duels. Well, now for fun, I want to show you why this same crucial prerequisite helps trigger arms races in our weapons too. In animals, we saw that simple changes in behavior, fighting inside tunnels, for example, or on branches instead of out in the open, simple changes in behavior could radically alter the nature of selection on the weapons by aligning male contests so that what had been a scramble now unfolded as duels. Well, we see exactly the same thing when we look to our own military past, where changes in technology altered the way that opponents interacted, causing them to confront each other in duels rather than scrambles. And in case after case, that simple change in behavior tipped the balance of selection, sparking an arms race. So for almost 1,000 years, oared galleys shuttled troops from place to place in the Mediterranean with almost no change at all in ship design or ship size. Then someone invents the battering ram, a cast bronze protrusion sort of jutting forward from the front of the boat. That simple change in technology changed everything. because boats stopped being vessels of transport and they started being units, sort of weapons in and of themselves. And ships could strike other ships and sink them if they were fast enough. So ships lined up against rival ships in one-on-one engagements or duels. And that simple change in behavior precipitated an arms race, for the faster ship had the advantage. And in that age, that meant more rowers. So ships started getting longer and longer until their hulls began to buckle. So then they started stacking rowers on top of each other, and one row of oars became two rows of oars became three. Soon shipbuilders were adding 2 or 3 men to each oar. So 3s became 4s and then 5s. Soon there were 8s and then 9s and then 11s and 13s. Ships got bigger and bigger and bigger until the race climaxed with a monstrosity called Ptolemy's 40. After 1,000 years of stasis, one simple change in technology aligned ship interactions so that scrambles became duels. And from that point forward, the race was on. In just 300 years, warships surged from pentaconters oared by 50 men to massive double-hulled behemoths powered by 4,000. Flash forward roughly 2,000 years, we see the whole thing happen again. By this point, ships had bigger hulls, and they could carry enough provisions to cross the globe. And all power was by sail. Sailing ships didn't ram very well. They tried. They had battering rams on the first sailing ships, and they get all tangled up. The sailing ships can't back up very well, and the rigging gets all tangled, so they got all snarled together. So they did not make very good warships. They tried putting cannon on the decks of these early ships, but that much weight on the decks made the ships tippy and unstable in rough seas. So these ships essentially served a function of transport and did not perform well as warships. But the invention of closable gun ports, those little flaps on the side that you can close in a storm, completely rewrote the terms of the rules of engagement. Because now cannon could be moved lower, down close to the waterline, where they actually made these ships more stable. And you could pack a lot of them in along the lengths of the sides of these ships. But these guns were not accurate. And on rolling ships in rough seas, they were not effective at all at large distances. So ships had to line up side by side with another ship in order to fire their broadside. Voila, one-on-one engagements, duels. From that point forward, bigger was better. You had to have the bigger ship. Bigger ships could pack more cannon. They could pack bigger cannon. They could unleash the bigger broadside. One row of cannon became 2. 2 rows of cannon became 3. 6-pounders gave way to 7-pounders, then 8-pounders, 20-pounders, 32-pounders, more cannon, bigger cannon. You get the idea. The race was on. But here, too, the crucial trigger of the arms race was a change in behavior. It was a new technology that forced battles to be fought at close range and one-on-one. So the nautical equivalent of a tunnel or a branch. And from that point forward, bigger became better, and selection pushed these weapons to the extreme. Well, when you step back and you think about it, that simple prerequisite actually applies to lots of our greatest arms races. So one-on-one fights, both in battle and in particular in tournaments, sparked explosive evolution of arms and armor in medieval knights. And one-on-one dogfights among the very first military aircraft sparked an arms race in fighter design and in planes. Again and again, we lost the screen. Again and again and again, the same prerequisites trigger the arms race. All right, before I end, I have to show you one more parallel here. Actually, I want to show you two. 2 more parallels here. They're part of the sequence of stages of arms races that I alluded to at the beginning. One thing that happens along the way is that as these weapons start to get really big, they begin to function as signals in addition to actual implements of battle. So only the best conditioned males, the absolute top of the lot, with the largest body sizes, the best immune systems, the most stored nutrients and energy reserves, only the best of the best can produce the really, really big weapons. And that means that weapon size becomes a pretty good indicator a billboard, if you will, of the fighting ability of a male. And rivals start using weapon size to decide whether or not to escalate a fight. They don't just lunge into battle. They assess each other beforehand. Whose weapon is bigger? Because weapons are honest signals of fighting ability, it often pays the smaller males to walk away. So weapons start to act as deterrents, settling contests without dangerous battle. In fact, in species with the biggest weapons of all, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of contests get settled this way, without actual battle. So one study in caribou, for instance, watched 11,000 male contests. Only 6 escalated all the way to full-on knockdown, drag-out battle. 6 out of 11,000. Caribou have the largest weapons relative to their body size of any living vertebrate. And more than 99.9% of their contests get settled without a fight. So this leads to an odd paradox, that species with the biggest weapons are often the most peaceful. Make no mistake, they can and they definitely do fight. But full-on fights tend to be relatively rare, and the net effect in these populations is peace. Well, we use big weapons as deterrents too. During the heyday of the British Empire, for example, first-rate ships of the line, absolutely state-of-the-art weapons. And they made splendid deterrents. Simply sailing one of these ships into troubled waters could settle disputes on the spot. The wooden hull of one of these ships required 11,000 oak trees. And for European nations that were largely deforested already, that cost was staggering. Most nations had none of these warships at all. Britain kept dozens and dozens in her fleet, and that period was called, incidentally, the Pax Britannica, the British peace. Well, we use our most expensive ships the same way today. A Nimitz-class carrier and its associated strike group costs more than $20 billion. The United States has 11 of these carrier strike groups. No other nation has one. Although I should change that, actually. I heard that China now has their first carrier strike group. Until very recently, no other nation had even one. Massive, powerful, prohibitively expensive. Our carriers function both as weapons and as deterrents. They are portable projections of military power that we shuttle like chess pieces to stabilize troubled regions and implement our policy. And I'm telling you that those weapons, at their core, are no different from these. Extreme weapons are extreme weapons, and their biology really is the same. And I also have to point out that this logic applies at the level of political landscapes and nations too. So the Cold War, for example, the most terrifying arms race of all time, was, at its core, a duel, as the world stage coalesced around two opposing superpowers, the United States and the USSR. Well, deterrence played a big part in that arms race too, and there are a lot of scholars that think that that's the only reason that we're still here today. All right, bear with me. One last parallel before I stop. The first parallel was duels. The second parallel was this idea of deterrence. The third and final parallel I want to show you right now is the idea of cheaters. So you're stuck in an arms race, and weapons are surging forward, evolving to bigger and bigger and bigger sizes, more elaborate, more extravagant, and much, much more expensive. We've just seen that makes these things great deterrents. They're billboards that honestly advertise fighting ability to an opponent. Well, they work as deterrents because only the best of the best, the richest nations and the biggest and healthiest bulls and bucks, only the wealthy can afford to pay these extraordinary costs. Well, so what does everybody else do? Supposing you're not the biggest male on the block. You're smaller, you're weaker. Life didn't smile on you the way that it did them. What do you do if you can't afford the biggest and the best weapons? The answer is you cheat. It turns out that cheating is rampant once you start to look for it. You find it everywhere. So take dung beetles. The biggest and the best males have these huge horns. These are the males that guard the tunnels. These are the males that win the fights. By defending the tunnels and winning the fights, they maintain access to the females that are inside the tunnels. Well, not all males are big. In fact, most of the males in these populations are tiny. Well, tiny males don't play by the rules. For one thing, they ditch the big weapons. Horns are expensive. They're not going to help you anyway if you're small. So these males are hornless. They actually look an awful lot like females. And they sneak into tunnels on the sly. So instead of fighting a losing battle at the entrance, they dig their own tunnel, a side tunnel, that intercepts the guarded tunnel beneath the guarding male. In this way, they can sneak into a tunnel undetected. And when they do, they go straight down to the female, mate with the female, turn around and leave. They can be in and out of that tunnel in as little as 10 minutes. Well, sneakers like this lurk in all sorts of animal populations. So small, sneaky cuttlefish cloak themselves in colors that look like females, and they sidle up next to a courting male, literally slipping in between the male and the female that he's courting. Sneaky male salmon zip into a territory, raining sperm in a cloud down on a female's eggs, in and out so fast that the territorial males can't stop them. Sneaky bighorn sheep, called coursers, race into a big bull's territory to mate with females while he's distracted in battle. So while he's in a fight, they sneak into the females. In species after species after species, males who can't play by the rules break the rules and cheat. Well, cheaters affect the whole dynamic of the arms race because they steal reproductive success from the big weaponed males. Those big males still pay the full price. They're still building and using their weapons, so the cost stays the same. But now the payoffs, the benefits that they glean from having these weapons get smaller. Because eggs that are fertilized by a sneaker male aren't fertilized by the guarding male. He produces the horns. He fights all day to guard the tunnel, but the offspring of that tunnel gets sired by another male. Well, as long as these sneaky males steal only a little bit, not much changes. The benefits of the big weapons stay huge. These arms races surge forward. But when the cheaters start doing too well, they can collapse an arms race. Because suddenly, it's not worth it anymore to produce these big weapons. Males without the big weapons start doing better than the males with the big weapons. And we expect these weapons to quickly disappear. Well, cheaters erode the success of our biggest weapons too. And they've done so for thousands of years. Asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics, these are the classic cheats. If you don't have the resources to face an invading force head on in conventional open battle, don't. Guerrilla tactics are like sneaky male fish and sneaky beetles. For one thing, they never wear military uniforms. Instead, they hide, blending in with civilians in much the same way that sneaky males look like females. They strike with quick, sneaky lunges, not open, sort of fair, honest one-on-one battle, and they use makeshift, inexpensive weapons like Molotov cocktails, pipe bombs, and IEDs. Well, here too, as with animals, as long as they don't inflict that much damage, nothing changes. State-of-the-art weapons continue to be well worth the price. But when a cheating tactic starts doing too well, then overnight they can collapse an arms race. And over throughout our history, technologies that cheated have collapsed an arms race. Often, these involve a new type of weapon. Always, they involve a tactic that's cheap. They win by not paying the price of the big weapons and by rendering those big weapons obsolete. So English longbows and gunpowder spelled the end for medieval armor. Once plate armor could be pierced, then suddenly it wasn't such a great idea to march into battle astride a horse like a big, shiny, bulky target. And overnight, armor went from being a fantastic form of protection to an expensive, heavy, bulky liability. Well, so too, exploding shells shattered the arms race of sailing warships. And submarines caused ironclad battleships to be obsolete. In every case, and there are dozens, new strategies that broke the rules of engagement caused our most expensive weapons to suddenly be obsolete, hugely expensive, and no longer worth the price. Well, as I close, I have to flash forward to the present day, and I have to leave you with a sobering thought. Because I am starting to suspect that we may be dangerously close to such a situation right now. As I'm sure you all know, the United States today stands alone as the sole superpower. And our weapons are both exorbitantly expensive and magnificent. We have the most advanced weapons in the world, and we are almost certainly safer because of it. Our newest technologies have incredible potential, both as weapons and as deterrents. So the Gerald Ford-class aircraft carriers, brand new, just $13 billion apiece. And the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, an aircraft that cost $400 billion to develop and to design and to build. These are great examples. But all of these weapons, all of them, depend critically on software. Steering and navigation of our destroyers and our aircraft carriers, guidance of our missile systems, also the sensor nets that we deploy to detect incoming missiles, command and control, safeguards on our nuclear weapons, all of these are controlled by computers and software. A pilot can't even fly a modern fighter without this software. Fly-by-wire systems, as they're called, are critical for handling these planes and for making sure that the pilots don't black out from the G-forces when these planes maneuver. And all of these systems are vulnerable to hackers. I mean, if you think about it, cyber hackers are the ultimate sneaks, surreptitiously worming into our control systems. I mean, honestly, I used to think that the danger of cyber hackers was a stolen credit card or identity theft. I mean, oh my gosh, did my worldview change when I started researching this book. It turns out that we've actually been hacked several times already. So in 2005, the Chinese broke into a suite of our state-of-the-art weapons systems, an event that was called Titan Rain. And in 2013, we caught them at it again. This time, they'd compromised the Terminal High Altitude Missile Defense System, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the F-22 Raptor, our MV-22 Osprey, as well as 37 other military systems, including our drones. And you know the scariest part? They weren't simply stealing trade secrets. They were inserting code. They were inserting code that was designed to hide there, to lurk undetected. And had they not been caught, these scripts would have given the Chinese complete control for our weapon systems. By activating these hidden programs, they could have turned our most expensive weapons against us, raising the alarming question of whether our weapons, too, might soon be obsolete. Like medieval armor and battleships before them, simply no longer worth the price. So I have to confess, this has been quite a journey for me, a ride more wild than any I could have imagined. I am a biologist, after all. I study beetles, not battleships. And who would have thought that poking around in dirt in a rainforest watching dung beetles would ever tell us anything about our weapons or about national security? And maybe you won't buy it. That's fine with me. I would actually love to be wrong here. But I have to say that the more I dug, the more convinced and astonished I became that there really are parallels between animals and ourselves. And I hope I've at least managed to convince you that there are exciting and surprising insights to be gleaned from the extraordinary weapons of beetles and crabs and caribou and elk. Thank you. I know that we might be on the hour and people may have to leave. That's totally fine. I will be happy to field questions. But before I do, I want to just take a second to thank a couple people, if that's okay. So first of all, I'd really like to thank Zoe Phelan for all of her Herculean efforts putting this thing together. I'd like to thank Charlie Jansen for nominating me for the Case Award. I'd like to thank my faculty colleagues and current and former students who took the time to write letters on my behalf, and Amy Kinch for putting so much effort into the nomination package. And finally, I'd like to shout out to David Tuss, a former University of Montana student and now a close friend, who did all of the incredible illustrations that I used in this talk and also that are in that book. He and his wife, Catherine, drove over from Helena for this. So thank you. Now I will take questions. So, is there time? think we have time for a few questions from the audience, general questions, but then, that'll be here for the reception, and people can approach you one-on-one if you have some more particular questions to ask.
Thank you very much, Doug. I don't know how much to thank you for what you've done, what you've accomplished, and I can't say, but I think I'm compelled to say how important I felt that your comparison of human conditions is with those in other biological systems. And I don't want to hog the discussion by any means, but as you may know, some of your colleagues and I, well, Bert Pfeiffer, who is a past zoologist, and I, with other scientists on campus, were very much concerned about the extreme weapons that we had developed that were poisoning the atmosphere with radiation, and we felt that something had to be done about that. I know that there are people, too, that would argue, and this is beyond the pale of this discussion because it would take too long, to say that transferring a mindset from one level of organization in the biological world to another, especially the most advanced, so to speak,
Yes.
is full of pitfalls. And
It's very easy to get it wrong.
But it really does lead to an excellent discussion on where we are. But I'm particularly thankful to you for bringing these facts out about what our particular arms race is costing us, and that's beyond compare in its own right. But then, with respect to the horned beetles versus man, whatever the horned beetles did or other animals did not threaten the survival of the human species. And that is one, I think, extremely important difference.
Yes.
That causes us to think more.
So can I comment on that? Let me just comment really briefly. First of all, I want to say thank you. I mean, when I started looking at the military technologies, I have to admit, at first it was a lark. My editors were saying, oh, you need to look at these parallels because it's a way to make the animal stories more relevant to your readers. And I started out just doing it as a thought exercise. And I got more and more stunned the more I read. And in particular, I came across the writings of a brilliant military historian, Robert O'Connell, who had actually done a lot of the same things and had come up with analyses of when and why military arms races occur. And he'd been reaching into biology for parallels. So here I was a biologist reaching into the military. He's a military historian reaching into biology. And when I realized that we were converging on the same ideas, that's when I started to believe that this isn't just an exercise, this is real. And it ended up becoming all-consuming. And I just have to add the political comment, too. I mean, I'm trying very hard to be apolitical here, and I have to be honest. I've gone back and forth. My family, for what it's worth, I come from a very politically liberal family. My wife's family, her father's a retired Air Force colonel that was #2 in command of the Titan missile base in Arizona during the Cold War. So I have like polar opposite family perspectives. And I started out thinking big weapons are bad. The more I read, the more convinced I was that, wow, I'm really glad to be in the United States because we are actually a whole lot safer here than just about anywhere else. And so I started to be convinced that maybe these things are more valuable than I thought before because they do work as deterrents. And then I discovered all the hacking and the cheaters, and the other cheater I didn't talk about today is weapons of mass destruction. And then all of a sudden I'm vacillating back like, oh my God, maybe we're spending all this money on things that we shouldn't be. I have no political agenda. All I want to do is get people to think. So what I really want to do and what I ended up trying to do with this book is just sort of launch the hand grenade and let it go. I want people to start making these comparisons and think about it on their own because I think that there really are valuable insights there. And you mentioned one other thing I'll hit really quickly. There is something that is unprecedented. I've been making parallels, and in the book, the whole way through, I'm going back and forth with parallels between animals and people. There is no animal precedent for a weapon of mass destruction. Never in the history of non-human animals has there ever been a weapon that was so dangerous that it could never be used. That is truly unprecedented. And honestly, Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time grappling with that, quite a bit of time writing about that in the end of this book, and in the end it scared the daylights out of me. Initially, during the Cold War, the weapons of mass destruction were the most technologically sophisticated and the most expensive weapons. And they played by the rules. They were just like elk antlers and crab claws. They were honest signals, and they worked as deterrents because there were really only two sides pushing against each other, and that's a predictable fight. But now these weapons of mass destruction are much less expensive. Our conventional weapons, like the Gerald Ford-class aircraft carriers, they are ridiculously expensive. They work perfectly like deterrents. But the weapons of mass destruction aren't very expensive. And dozens of countries now have them. And before long, it's likely to assume that groups, organizations that aren't even nations will get their hands on them. And now you're talking about something that biologically is like a scramble. It's a lot less predictable because there's a whole lot of agendas and a lot more countries in the fray. And now they have their hands on weapons that are really, really dangerous that should never be used. And it's not clear whether they will work as deterrents in that situation. Some people think they will, others think that they won't. And so, honestly, I had trouble sleeping for a while after I finished all of this. I chose not to throw that into the talk because I didn't want to be doom and gloom. But it is true that the animal parallels come to a screeching halt because we reach sort of uncharted territory. I mean, honestly, I'm a biologist. We've got people that are better molecular biologists than me in the audience, but I'll bet you that for a couple $1,000s, you could download the sequence for the 1918 pandemic strain of influenza from GenBank, sequence it in the lab, come up with a pretty crude vector, and you'd have a biological weapon of mass destruction manufactured for thousands of dollars in a basement. You know, when we live in an age where that is possible, the political landscape becomes a whole lot scarier. But again, there is no parallel for the animals on that one, so I usually step back from that. Anyway, thanks. If people, any other questions? Easier questions, come on. No, Brandon. Yeah.
So I haven't really thought this out because it comes on the heels of your comments just now, but you know, it seems like with the animals we're talking about competition among individuals within a species. And on the human side, there are at least a couple different divisions here. One is
Yes.
Nations, one is non-nation organizations, one is everyone from nations to the cheaters that are not necessarily even organized.
Yes.
So, you know, where does that start to break down? Like, if you don't have the organization of...
I don't think it breaks down the way that you're thinking. I just think it's a little bit more complicated to articulate, so I chose not to put it into the talk. But lots of the arms races happen with units that are sort of odd. It's a vehicle versus a vehicle. So the weapons themselves compete in a ritualized or repeatable fashion like a duel. That's the kind of backdrop that can set the stage for the evolution of the weapons. And one of the things I try to go to great lengths to be clear about when I have the space in the book is that the evolution of the weapons isn't the same as the evolution of the people. It's changes in technology, and that's driven by battlefield and market value things. So weapons, people are constantly tinkering and trying to change weapon designs, and some work better than others, and the ones that work really well are the ones everybody wants, and those sweep the market and become the new technology, and the ones that don't work disappear. That's the kind of process we're talking about for the weapons a lot of the time. And so in that case, it can literally be tank versus tank, plane versus plane. That's the spark that triggers the arms race. When you get to nations, it gets more complicated. And in that case, the reason is you're not looking at turnover in the populations the same way that you are with crabs or with elk or with machine guns or tanks. Now you're talking about phenomena that happen within the lifetime of a nation. So the evolution on the political scale usually isn't countries arising and countries disappearing. That kind of turnover doesn't happen. It's more an issue of under what circumstances will one nation change its pattern of allocation, change its behavior when confronted with another. And so in that sense, the parallel is actually a lot like two individuals within a caribou or a crab species. If two crabs come up to each other, they assess each other. Are they going to escalate or not? And they wave their weapons, and if the weapons work as a good enough deterrent and one is much bigger than the other, the smaller one walks away. A lot of the politics that you see among nation states works that way. So the parallel does actually work. It just works in a slightly different way, and you're right to point that out. So hopefully that makes sense.
Or not mine, but maybe one more question?
One more question, I think.
Oh, I see.
I'm actually going to steal a question from Mark. because he asked it and I didn't know the answer, which is why do female caribou have such big antlers?
Okay. A lot of people have argued about that one a lot. So most of the systems that I'm talking about here are systems where the investment in the weapons is primarily a male-driven phenomenon. And there are a few exceptional species where the roles are tipped and everything works backwards. But the caribou actually aren't one of those. Caribou are one where the antlers are much, much bigger in the males than they are in the females. And what appears to have happened is that there's been sort of a correlated carryover. A lot of females express sort of rudimentary versions of the antlers, and they seem to function in a totally different context. So it's not competition with rivals over access to reproduction, which is what's going on with the males. It's usually safeguarding critical food resources that they need for the survival of their young during critical winter periods when food is really localized and really limiting and hard for them to get access to. So females often use them to fight other caribou, but fighting over food resources. It's a different ecological context and a different function. But a number of people have thought about when and why do females produce weapons. And the problem in a nutshell is that weapons are expensive most of the time. And if the females are investing heavily in reproduction, things like pregnancy or yolking up big eggs, then the price that they pay for investing in weapons is much steeper than the price that males pay. And often the differences in reproductive success are driven by things like fecundity in females, not competition for mates as in males. But I will tell you there's a role-reversed example. One of my favorites is a bird called the jacana that lives in Panama, where the males do all the parental care. So the females will lay eggs and then leave, and the male takes care of the brood, and it takes them a long time to take care of the young. So they're sort of out of commission. The females are available and ready to breed, and there aren't enough males to go around because they're taking care of the young. And so the females fight with other females. And then jacanas, the females are bigger than the males. They're stronger than the males. They've got bigger weapons. They've got these spurs on their wings that they use in the fights just like the males would. So everything that plays out in a typical species plays out in the jacanas, but it's backwards because the males are investing more in reproduction in that case. They become sort of limiting, and an excess of females fights over them. So.
I'll just comment that came from one of Doug's earliest.
With my dad. It was and the original jacana work was done by Don Jenny, right? Or no?
Right there. So,
sitting in the audience.
I'm sure there are many, many more questions. I know Doug will be happy to talk to you one-on-one. So let's go back, get some refreshments, and thank Doug again.